January 1547, the air inside Whitehall Palace hung thick with sickness, candle smoke, and fear. Courtiers whispered in the corridors, physicians moved with trembling hands, and servants refused to meet one another's eyes. Everyone already knew the truth, but no one dared say it. England's most powerful monarch, the man who made kingdoms tremble and sent noblemen to the scaffold with a single breath, was dying. And yet even in his last days, no one in the palace knew how to act, for Henry Roman VIII's final moments were far more terrifying than anything England had witnessed in his turbulent reign. He was only 55, but Henry now looked closer to 80. His once towering frame had swollen to more than 350 pounds. A festering wound on his leg, first caused by a jousting accident decades earlier, had grown infected again. Physicians described the stench filling his chambers as nearly unbearable. The ulcer oozed continuously, requiring bandages that had to be changed repeatedly each day. Like many rulers of his time, Henry Roman VIII lived in a world without modern medicine, but his condition was not simply the result of infection. It was the physical embodiment of decades of war, political brutality, marital turmoil, and his own unrestrained appetite for power. By the winter of 1546, he could barely stand, let alone walk. Men had to carry him by mechanical pulleys into bed or onto a wheeled chair. His breathing was heavy, unstable, often punctuated by sudden fits of coughing that left attendants wondering whether the king would survive the hour. What terrified them most was not simply the sight of Henry dying. It was the knowledge that he still possessed the absolute power to command executions even while gasping for breath. For years, England had learned to fear his temper. This was the king who had broken from the Catholic Church, seized monasteries, executed close advisers, and ordered the beheading of wives. To displease Henry, even unintentionally, meant risking not only your career but your life. His final days did not weaken this atmosphere. They intensified it. No one wanted to carry bad news to the king. No one dared speak openly about his approaching death. Under Tudor law, predicting the death of a monarch was considered treason. The penalty was execution, and so the palace lived in suffocating silence. Henry's condition worsened dramatically after Christmas 1546. He could not sleep. He drifted in and out of consciousness. At times he muttered names: Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell, almost as if his past rose to confront him in the dark. He demanded food he could not digest, wine he should not drink, and medicine that had no effect. His swollen body required enormous bedsheets, specially made. His doctors used mixtures of herbs, poultices, and untested remedies, but nothing reversed the decline. Some historians believe Henry suffered from kidney disease, congestive heart failure, and complications from untreated diabetes. Others argue that his leg wound poisoned his blood repeatedly, leading to fevers and delirium. But behind the physical decay lay something far more unnerving. The king's mind remained sharp enough to sense the vultures circling. Everyone around him was planning for the future: his council, his ambitious courtiers, foreign ambassadors, rival noble families, and Henry knew it. He was determined to control England even after death. But to do that, he needed to finalize one last monumental decision: who would rule for his 9-year-old son, Prince Edward. This decision created invisible tension throughout Whitehall. Two powerful factions, the conservative Catholic nobles led by the Duke of Norfolk, and the Protestant reformers led by the Seymours, were locked in a silent war. Each hoped to shape the kingdom after Henry's death. Each wanted control of young Edward, and both sides feared one thing above all: Henry's unpredictable wrath, even from his sick. The king's counselors approached his bedside cautiously, often speaking in soft, respectful tones while watching for any sign of irritation. His temper could swing from calm to explosive in moments. On good days, he conversed sharply about France, Scotland, and trade. On bad days, he glared with suspicion, convinced that men were plotting against him. Many were, but they would never admit it while Henry still breathed. In the meantime, the king's physical condition grew more disturbing. Bandages soaked through with blood and pus. The stench of decay permeated the chamber. His legs were so swollen that attendants sometimes had to cut open his boots. He had difficulty swallowing. His eyes appeared sunken, his skin greyish and wax-like. Yet despite all this, the royal physicians refused to pronounce him dying. If they did, they could be charged with treason. Outside the king's chamber, palace servants whispered prayers. Members of the nobility quietly summoned lawyers. Foreign ambassadors sent coded letters back to their rulers, describing Henry's worsening condition with carefully chosen words, never openly predicting death. Everyone wanted to know how long the king would live, but no one dared ask. The tension intensified when Henry summoned Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, one of the most influential reformers in England. Courtiers whispered that this was a sign. The king knew the end was near, but even then they could not speak openly. Henry had to utter the words himself, that his life was drawing to a close. He never did, not until the final hours. Meanwhile, news circulated that the Duke of Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, were to be executed for treason. The king had signed the orders from his sict, proving that even near death his hand remained deadly. The Earl of Surrey was executed on January 19, 1547. Norfolk was spared only because Henry died before the execution date. This single moment showed England that Henry's final days were as dangerous as any period of his reign. Inside the palace, guards tightened their patrols. The council moved cautiously. No one knew who would rise or fall once the king drew his last breath. The uncertainty itself became a source of fear, because when a Tudor king died, the entire kingdom trembled. Succession disputes had sparked rebellions and civil wars before, and it could happen again. By mid-January, Henry could scarcely speak. Attendants reported long stretches where he lay motionless, eyes half open, breathing shallowly. When he did speak, his voice was faint but firm. He ordered that his will be finalized. He demanded control even as death crept closer. The French and Scottish ambassadors watched anxiously. Everyone knew that whatever happened in Henry's final days would shape the future of England, Scotland, France, and the European balance of power. And still, no one dared say the truth aloud. Henry VIII, one of the most feared rulers in history, was dying in a manner as grim, painful, and terrifying as the darkest legends of his reign. His body was failing. His temper still ruled, and England waited behind closed doors, breathless, for the moment when the king who shattered kingdoms would finally lose the only battle he could not escape. By the third week of January 1547, Whitehall Palace had transformed into a place ruled not by the king, but by fear. Every hallway seemed colder, every whispered conversation more cautious, every footstep heavier. Henry VIII, once a monarch of immense strength and ambition, now spent most of his hours drifting between consciousness and fevered delirium. And while his body weakened, the political storm surrounding him grew more violent with each passing day. Power, the very thing Henry had fought for all his life, was slipping from his fingers, and those around him were scrambling to catch it before he died. Young Prince Edward, only 9 years old, was kept far from the king's chambers. Tutors and guardians whispered to him that his father needed rest, that England prayed for his recovery, but even a child could sense the truth. The palace did not move with the rhythm of a kingdom under control. It moved like a fortress preparing for collapse. Guards doubled their patrols, councillors appeared pale and anxious, doors were kept shut, messages were delivered in sealed envelopes. At meals, no one dared to laugh, and Edward, soon to be king whether he understood the weight or not, watched the adults with wide, uncertain eyes. Inside Henry's chamber, the struggle was even more intense. Each faction of the court wanted to be nearest to the king in his final moments. Whoever held influence during the last hours would shape England's future. The conservative Catholic faction, tied to the powerful Howard family, had been dealt a devastating blow when the Earl of Surrey was executed for treason just days earlier. Henry had signed the death warrant from his sict, proving once again that even near death he could destroy an entire lineage with a single signature. Surrey's father, the Duke of Norfolk, awaited execution as well, but fate intervened one final time. The king's deterioration slowed the process. Papers stalled. Authorization was delayed. Norfolk's life depended on the hours Henry continued to breathe. On the opposite side stood the Seymour faction, led by Edward Seymour, the king's brother, in-law and uncle to Prince Edward. The Seymours understood better than anyone that their power depended on ensuring Henry named them guardians of the new king. They monitored every visitor who entered the king's chamber. They intercepted letters, whispered advice to the physicians, watched the king's mood with icy calculation, and waited. Henry, in his weakened state, could sense all of this. His eyes still held a sharpness, a suspicion that had defined his entire reign. Even in agony, he understood the danger of leaving too much freedom to ambitious men. The king's leg ulcer had grown worse with each day. The stench now filled not only his chamber, but seeped into the adjoining hallway. Servants carried perfumes, burning herbs, and pots of vinegar, trying desperately to mask the smell, but nothing could veil the rot. Some historians believe the ulcer had tunneled deep into the bone, a condition that would have caused unbearable pain. At times Henry screamed in agony, shocking even the hardened guards stationed outside his door. During these episodes, his attendants worried that the king's final orders might be issued in a frenzy. After all, it would not be the first time a Tudor monarch acted out of pain, paranoia, or fury. Yet Henry did not lose his instinct for control. He demanded that his will be reviewed again. He issued instructions regarding his burial at Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he claimed had truly given him joy. It was as if he sought to rewrite his legacy even as time slipped away. But his counselors realized something alarming. The king had not yet explicitly acknowledged that he was dying. Until he did so, no priest could be officially summoned for last rites, and no counselor could legally activate the transition of power. England was frozen between life and death, between the reign of Henry VIII and the beginning of Edward VI rule. There were nights when Henry awoke suddenly, breathing hard, calling out for people who had been dead for years. Some nights he called for Jane Seymour, the queen who had died giving him his only legitimate son. Other nights he murmured something indistinct, names lost in fever, regrets swallowed in darkness. Whether these were visions, hallucinations, or the king's mind confronting its own history, no one knew. The physicians wrote nothing down. To reveal the details of the king's mental state could be dangerous. Rumors of madness, even if false, could destroy families and spark rebellions. On January 27, 1547, Henry awoke weaker than ever. Those in the chamber knew instantly that something had changed. His breath rattled. His skin had a greyish pallor. His eyes struggled to focus. He murmured faintly, as though speaking through water. The physicians exchanged grim glances. Once again they avoided the word dying, but everyone understood. Henry could not hold on much longer. This was the moment the Seymour faction had been waiting for. Edward Seymour and Sir Anthony Denny, one of the king's closest attendants, approached the king with cautious reverence. Denny, in a quiet voice, told Henry that he must prepare his soul. No one else had dared say it. For the first time, Henry VIII, the man who reshaped religion, executed wives, toppled nobles, built a navy, and crushed rebellions, was confronted with the undeniable truth. He was dying. The shock was not theatrical. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was a simple, chilling silence that filled the chamber. Henry blinked slowly, absorbing the words. Whether fear touched his heart in that moment, none could say. But for the first time in days, he spoke with surprising clarity. "Yes," he said, "bring Archbishop Thomas Cranmer." Messengers rushed through the palace. Guards stepped aside. Doors swung open. Courtiers felt the shift ripple through every hall. The king had acknowledged the approach of death, and with that admission, England's most dangerous legal barrier had dissolved. Now the council could prepare for succession. Now power could transfer. Now the future of the realm hung on mere hours. Cranmer arrived as quickly as he could, but the king had already slipped into unconsciousness again. His breathing was slow, shallow, uneven. Cranmer held Henry's hand, asking him to squeeze if he trusted in his salvation. Witnesses reported a faint pressure, a final sign of awareness. It was the last voluntary act of Henry VIII. Outside the king's chamber, the atmosphere shifted from anxious waiting to a controlled panic. The Seymours began positioning themselves for authority. Conservative nobles retreated, afraid of being arrested the moment the king died. Servants carried messages through secret corridors. Guards checked windows, gates, and entrances. Even the kitchens went silent. A kingdom had stopped breathing, waiting for the final announcement. Inside the chamber, Henry's pulse slowed. His breaths grew further apart. His massive chest rose and fell with great difficulty. The fever had taken hold. The infection was overwhelming. The heart that had once beaten with ambition, rage, passion, and royal command was failing. And in those final moments, surrounded not by the wives he had married or the enemies he had crushed, but by silent attendants and a grieving priest, the king who had terrified Europe drifted into the last darkness of his life. The last sound he heard may have been a whispered prayer, or perhaps in the fading haze of death he heard the echoes of everything he had done, the reforms, the wars, the executions, the betrayals, rising like a shadow over England's future. On the morning of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII was dead, but the terror of his final days was only the beginning of a new and uncertain struggle for power. When Henry VIII finally slipped into death in the early hours of January 28, 1547, the first reaction inside the chamber was not mourning. It was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence, as if every person present understood the enormity of what had just occurred. The King of England, the man who shattered the church, reshaped the government, destroyed enemies, and commanded armies, was gone. Yet no one moved, no one spoke, no one cried. Instead, each man in the room looked at the others, wondering who would be the first to break the stillness and what the consequences might be. Because in Tudor England, even death was political. Henry's death could not be announced immediately. The council knew that the moment the news became public, chaos might erupt. England had seen kings die before, and every time the result was unpredictable. Rebellions could rise, foreign nations could strike. Ambitious nobles could seize lands or titles, and this time the new king was only 9 years old. A child could not stop ambitious men. A child could not lead armies. A child could not calm a kingdom. So the death was kept secret. For 2 long days, Henry VIII's body lay inside the chamber while the council worked in absolute secrecy. Guards were stationed outside the doors, sworn to silence under threat of death. Courtiers who approached the entrance were turned away with vague excuses. The bells of London did not toll, no announcement was made. Even the palace servants, who always sensed news faster than the council intended, were kept completely in the dark. Inside the council chamber, a storm of political maneuvering began. At the center stood Edward Seymour, the king's brother-in-law. He had played a careful game for months, positioning himself to seize power the moment Henry died. Now, with the king's body still cooling in bed, Seymour moved with quiet confidence. The first and most crucial decision was simple yet dangerous. He would appoint himself Lord Protector of England. The king's will did not explicitly give Seymour that title. It created a council of 16 men who were meant to share power equally until young Prince Edward came of age. But Seymour knew that equal power meant constant fighting, and constant fighting meant weakness. England would fracture, Europe would see opportunity, Scotland would strike, France might invade. Only a single ruler could stabilize the realm, and that ruler would be him, but he also understood the risk. If the council refused to support him, he could lose everything. So he acted quickly, moving from one noble to the next, securing promises, offering rewards, threatening consequences, and presenting himself as the only man capable of guiding the new king. His allies supported him, his enemies feared him. By the time the sun set on the day after Henry's death, Seymour had secured enough signatures to dominate the government. While this quiet coup unfolded, Henry's corpse continued to decay. Tudor embalming methods were crude, and Henry's enormous size made the process even more difficult. His leg ulcer had infected his blood for weeks, possibly months. Now that the heart had stopped beating, the internal gases began to build. The smell became overwhelming. Servants moved hurriedly with candles and cloths soaked in perfumes, but nothing could hide the stench. Even the thick Tudor tapestries could not contain it. The king, who once wore jewels, gold, and velvet, now lay as a swollen and decaying reminder of mortality. It was a disturbing contrast to the power he once wielded. Meanwhile, the political world outside the palace continued unaware. The city of London carried on with business as usual. Merchants opened their shops. Fishermen prepared their nets. Foreign ambassadors sent reports home, all the while wondering why royal audiences had been postponed. In France, King Francis, I suspected something was wrong, but he could not act without confirmation. In Scotland, Mary of Guise watched anxiously, knowing England's next steps would determine the future of Scottish independence. And in Rome, the papacy waited for any sign of weakness, hoping perhaps that England might one day return to the Catholic Church. Inside Whitehall, the council completed their plan. On January 30, 2 days after Henry's death, the gates of the palace swung open, and the news finally began to spread. Bells tolled across London, echoing through the cold winter air. Priests prepared masses, nobles rushed toward the capital, foreign ambassadors scrambled to decode what the announcement meant for the balance of power in Europe, but ordinary people reacted with a mixture of shock and confusion. Many had only ever known one king. Henry VIII had ruled for more than 37 years. His decisions had shaped every household in the realm. He had changed their churches, their taxes, their laws, their marriages, even their understanding of God. For many, his death felt like the end of an era of violence for some, progress for others, and uncertainty for all. As the bells rang across the city, preparations began for Henry's funeral procession. It would take days of planning. His coffin had to be reinforced due to his weight. Horses had to be selected, banners prepared, armor polished, clergy chosen, and roads cleared. But while the public focused on the funeral, the true events determining England's future were happening far from the streets. Edward Seymour quietly removed rivals from influence. Members of the conservative faction who had favoured the Duke of Norfolk found themselves sidelined. Norfolk himself remained in the Tower of London, spared execution only because Henry died before signing the final order, but he was no longer a threat. Seymour controlled the Tower. Seymour controlled the council. Seymour controlled the boy king, and Prince Edward, now King Edward VIII, was informed of his father's death in a carefully staged moment. Some accounts say he responded with tears. Others say he appeared calm, understanding better than most children the weight of destiny. But one thing is certain, he was immediately taken under Seymour's protection, surrounded by advisers chosen not for loyalty to Henry, but for loyalty to Seymour. The boy king was crowned as the new ruler of England, but everyone understood that real power belonged to the protector. Meanwhile, courtiers whispered about one more disturbing detail. During the transport of Henry's coffin from Whitehall to Sion Abbey, the wagon halted due to the roughness of the road. According to tradition, blood from the corpse leaked through the coffin and dripped onto the floor. Whether this tale was true or exaggerated, it spread rapidly through England. For many commoners, it became a symbolic reminder that a king's legacy could not be hidden, that judgment from heaven came for all men, even the most powerful. Others whispered something darker, that the king who destroyed monasteries and executed wives had not died quietly but with a troubled soul. These rumours were impossible to quell. Tudor England was a land where religion, superstition, and politics intertwined, and Henry had ruled through a combination of all three. As the funeral procession moved through the countryside, thousands gathered to witness it. Some bowed with solemn respect. Others watched silently, their expressions unreadable. A handful of men even murmured prayers not for Henry but for his victims. In the countryside, rumours grew of divine punishment, strange omens, and signs in the sky. The death of a king always created stories. The death of Henry VIII created legends. Yet while England mourned or celebrated depending on personal loyalties, the council in London worked tirelessly. They drafted new laws, replaced old allies, restructured the government, and prepared to reshape England into a fully Protestant realm, something Henry had only partially embraced during his lifetime. Edward Seymour saw an opportunity to not just rule England, but to transform it. But he also knew something else. His power sat on top of the most unstable political moment in Tudor history. One mistake could destroy him. One rebellion could topple the boy king. One miscalculation could throw the realm into chaos. And as England buried its most infamous monarch, a new chain of events began events that would lead to rebellion, revolution, and the destruction of those who believed they could control the forces Henry VIII had unleashed. As Henry VIII's coffin made its way toward Windsor for burial, England stood suspended between the world Henry had built and the one that would rise from the aftermath of his death. The echoes of his reign were everywhere, on the torn ruins of monasteries, in the trembling voices of nobles who feared his wrath, in the new churches that replaced centuries, old Catholic tradition, and in the cautious steps of every politician navigating the dangerous path ahead. Yet none of this prepared England for what would follow. The final days of Henry VIII were terrifying not only because of how he died, but because of what his death unleashed. Edward VI, the 9-year-old boy suddenly elevated to the throne, was overwhelmed by responsibility. He was intelligent, unusually well-educated, and deeply Protestant in belief, but he was still a child. He could not make decisions alone. He could not lead armies. He could not interpret political conspiracies or manage the ambitions of powerful men. And that made him the most valuable possession in all of England. Whoever controlled Edward controlled the realm. Edward Seymour, newly named Duke of Somerset, moved swiftly. As Lord Protector, he took command of Edward's household, the royal treasury, the Privy Council, and even the king's personal education. He positioned himself not just as guardian, but as father figure. Edward admired him, trusted him, looked to him for guidance, and Somerset used that trust to reshape England in ways Henry VIII had never dared. Henry, for all his changes, had kept England balanced between tradition and reform. But Somerset wanted nothing less than a complete transformation. His government pushed rapidly toward Protestantism. Church services were rewritten. Priests were allowed to marry. Altars were stripped of images. Catholic ceremonies were banned. Latin prayers were replaced with English. The entire religious identity of the kingdom began to shift, but change came at a price. Many commoners felt lost. The country split between old believers and new reformers. And resentment spread like fire across towns and villages. Henry VIII had kept England under control through fear. Somerset tried to rule through ideology, but England was not ready. Meanwhile, Europe watched closely. France and Scotland saw opportunity. The alliance between the two kingdoms, known as the Old Alliance, grew stronger. The Scottish Queen, young Mary, was seen as a potential rival to Edward, especially as England tried to force a political marriage between the children. This tension ignited the conflict known as the Rough Wooing, a brutal expansion of Henry Roman VIII's earlier wars. But Henry's true legacy appeared not on the battlefield, but in the political chaos that followed his death. Somerset, despite controlling the throne, underestimated the danger of the nobles around him. Henry had ruled like a lion, eliminating threats without hesitation. Somerset tried diplomacy, but diplomacy could not satisfy the ambitious. John Dudley, the ambitious Earl of Warwick, was one such man. He watched Somerset carefully, gathering allies, biding his time. He understood what Somerset did not, that power held without fear could be taken. While Somerset pushed religious reform and military campaigns, England's economy plunged into crisis. Inflation rose, food prices spiked, landowners enclosed farmlands, causing riots among peasants. The poor cried out for relief, but received punishments instead. Rebellions erupted across the kingdom, including the massive Prayer Book Rebellion in the west and Kett's Rebellion in the east. Tens of thousands joined uprisings driven by hunger, anger, and confusion. Henry Roman VIII had kept the country united through brute force. Without that force, fractures appeared everywhere. Somerset struggled to contain the rebellions, but each defeat weakened him further. The council began to question his leadership. And eventually, Dudley made his move. He persuaded key nobles that Somerset was a danger to the kingdom, that his rule threatened stability. In a dramatic reversal, the same council that had crowned Somerset with power now stripped him of it. He was arrested and imprisoned. Edward was separated from his uncle. The protectorate collapsed. Somerset, once the most powerful man in England, had underestimated the shadow of Henry Roman VIII. Henry's entire reign had taught England one lesson: power must be absolute, or it will crumble. Somerset had ignored that lesson, and he paid for it. Dudley took his place, becoming the new master of England. Under his leadership, the country moved even faster toward religious reform. Churches changed, laws changed, the culture itself changed. England was no longer the world Henry Roman VIII had shaped. It was a kingdom racing toward a different future, one that would ignite conflicts and transformations for decades to come. Meanwhile, Prince Edward grew older, absorbing the pressures of kingship. But his health was fragile, likely weakened by hereditary medical conditions or chronic infections. By age 15, his body began to fail. His coughing worsened, his weight dropped, his energy drained. Physicians attempted every treatment known to Tudor medicine, but nothing helped. And as Edward weakened, Dudley faced a terrifying question: what would happen when the boy king died? If Edward died without an heir, Henry Roman VIII's older daughter Mary would inherit the throne. Mary was a devout Catholic. She would reverse every Protestant reform made under Edward. Dudley could not allow that. So he made a desperate, dangerous plan. He convinced Edward to name Lady Jane Grey, Henry Roman VIII's Protestant granddaughter, as his successor. The plan seemed perfect, until Edward died in 1553. England was thrown into crisis again. Lady Jane Grey was declared queen, but the people rejected her. They rallied behind Mary Tudor, and within days, Mary's supporters overwhelmed Dudley's forces. Mary became queen. Dudley was executed. Jane was imprisoned. Somerset was already dead. The men who had tried to shape England after Henry Roman VIII fell one by one, and the kingdom returned to the rule of a Tudor, who remembered everything Henry had done to her and her mother. Mary's reign would be marked by a brutal religious crackdown that earned her the name Bloody Mary. Hundreds were burned at the stake. Catholicism returned by force. England plunged into fear once again. And yet even Mary could not restore the world that existed before Henry Roman VIII. Too much had changed. Too much had been broken. Too much had been rebuilt in new forms. Her sister Elizabeth would rise after her, ushering in one of England's most celebrated eras. But even Elizabeth lived under the shadow of Henry, his decisions, his reforms, his destruction of the Catholic Church, his centralization of power, his transformation of the monarchy. In the end, the terror of Henry Roman VIII's final days lay not only in his physical suffering, but in the political earthquake that followed. His death removed the iron fist that had held the kingdom together for nearly 4 decades. Without it, ambition exploded, reforms accelerated, rebellions ignited, and the struggle for England's soul reached its peak. Henry VIII's final days were a mirror of his reign, chaotic, dangerous, unpredictable, and violent in ways that reshaped the kingdom forever. His body decayed, but his influence did not. He left behind a country fractured by religion, burdened by political instability, filled with powerful families who hated one another, and ruled by a terrified child king who never had a chance to grow into the role thrust upon him. The world Henry VIII left behind was not peaceful. It was a battlefield, and the shockwaves of his final days would echo for generations, shaping the rise of Protestant England, the triumph of Elizabeth I, and the eventual emergence of the British Empire. In life he commanded fear, in death he unleashed chaos, and that chaos transformed England more profoundly than any law he had passed or any wife he had executed.